some of you know, or some of you might know, I'm often reticent to discuss the topic of Kabbalah. So when Rabbi Kahn rang me a little while ago and said, would I give a talk, but sometime between Pesach and Shavuot, on the subject of Kabbalah, and I was inclined to say no, because it's just not a subject, although I spend most of my time in it, it's not a subject that has been successfully, in my opinion, transmitted. One of the reasons behind that, and I'm already into the talk now, this is not simply by way of introduction, the content has already started, but one of the reasons behind that is because when you speak to a group of people such as this, and I'm looking around at the faces, some of whom I recognize, some of whom I don't, and some of whom I almost recognize, all from past lives, is that when you look at a group like this, there is such an incredible disparity in prior knowledge. So that I don't know if I'm speaking to people who are complete novices and just want to know about this, or if I'm speaking to people who are very informed and that's why they decided to come here, because they wanted to enrich their already informed perspectives. I don't know any of that, and the chances are, and the likelihood is, that we've got a bit of everyone in this room. I'm going to talk about very advanced concepts. And the challenge that I'm going to do in this 4-part series is to give over some very advanced concepts, starting from basically zero. Okay? So the challenge is to try and absorb that so that the outcome would be the same as if you studied this for 10 years on these particular points. But you'll understand the points because we're going to unfold them from the beginning. Everybody follow what I'm doing? If you find that the talk is too severe, too intellectual, too high, then let me or Rabbi Kahn know and we'll bring it down. If you find the talk way too basic and I'm basically wasting your time, we can up the level, we can. But it's always good to go over, it's always good to revise the basics, is it not? So, the question then, and I'm still in content here, this is not just introduction, this is really a part of what I really need to communicate to you about how this 4-part series is going to go, whether you come back for the other 3 or not. Is that with that ambiguity of would you please take a course on something to do with Kabbalah, I'm kind of left, you know, like a person who's, well, and I was going to bring a metaphor of a person in front of a smorgasbord at a kiddush, but in fact, thank you very much. The reality is that we have to anchor it somehow. You can't just go and start talking about Kabbalah. People who do will inevitably find themselves inside a vacuum, or that no one knows what they're talking about. You need an anchor for that. And it just so happens that I've been giving a lot of thought to the type of anchor I would like to communicate in my teaching in the field of Kabbalah, where I consider myself after quite a few decades of immersion in it, I still consider myself a teacher. I'm not a teacher, a student. The great teachers of Kabbalah in our world, they take it to another level, but they have given me permission to teach. So I'm like someone who sits in the academy every day, and I see what's going on, and then they allow me to go out and speak about it on occasion. The reality is, we need an anchor for how I'm going to talk about it. And the anchor is this. What they sometimes don't tell you at school is that Jewish history itself, for example, the rabbi spoke about the subject of Jewish history, and I've thought about that too a bit. And this course is called a Kabbalistic journey through time, is that Jewish history itself is of a cosmic nature and is involved in the business of revelation. Now, unless that project of revelation, and it's the revelation of godliness in the world and the revelation of unity in the world, ultimately with the purpose of raising human consciousness so that we can actually begin history. But if you're going to have a project of continuous revelation, then it needs to be continuous revelation. It's not that we once had a revelation. Everybody talks about the revelation at Sinai, which we're going to be celebrating on Shavuot in a few weeks, and everybody talks about that. But it's not that we're always thinking back, lemafreya, as they say in Hebrew, to that revelation, and that's when it was, and it doesn't happen again. There's a famous midrashic line that everything that was destined to be revealed was revealed to Moses at Sinai, and that's fine. But we don't have access to those revelations. They become further revealed, underlining the word revealed, throughout history. History is an ongoing project of revelation. It's important to remember that point. I'm going to come back to it. The second point I want us to note, and what this course is founded on, and this is kind of where we're pushing towards territory that is not always, in fact hardly ever stated, and that is that it is the nature of the revelation of the Jewish people in the world about God and about the purpose of the world and about the human being. It is in the nature of that project of revelation that it moves constantly towards synthesis. It takes what exists, and without getting too Hegelian about it, the next level of revelation is almost always a synthesis of previous revelations that appear at first to not be connected, which are suddenly burst through by a divine light of revelation that pierces the consciousness first of the Jewish people and then the world, about a new paradigm that synthesizes both those, or both or more of those. Does everybody follow? That's the meaning of synthesis. And when we look at the revelation of Kabbalah within Jewish history, we see precisely that. We see precisely that. Now, one of our earliest Kabbalistic texts, in fact, one of the ones I'm going to talk about tonight, has a very enigmatic statement in it about the transmission of Kabbalistic knowledge. And it says it really has three different dimensions to it. I brought markers. We have a marker? That's an amateur's marker. Remember that scene in Crocodile Dundee? That's a marker. Now, these three dimensions that the earliest text within the Kabbalistic tradition refers to, three ways in which we can communicate revelation. Through Sefer, put your hand up if you can read Hebrew letters. Put your hand up if you can't. Okay. Someone put a finger up, I'm not sure what that means. Sefer, Sfar, same word but obviously different nikud, different voweling. Sefer, of course, means book or text. Sfar means mazeli spor. So Sfar is number. And Sipur, which is, of course, story, narrative, communication. Obviously, we immediately note that all of these have the same root. And obviously, they're going to go on to become the root of the word Sefirah, which is going to be so paramount to what we're going to discuss tonight. Sefer, Sfar, Sipur. Basically, and I'll come back to who gave this nomenclature later, book or text, number, communication. Yep. It's the first of those, it is the first of those that is going to be our anchor. Because there is no transmission of Kabbalistic knowledge without the texts of Kabbalistic knowledge. Revelation comes into the world through the concept of, into the Jewish world through the concept of Sefer, through the concept of book. If people weren't writing books, it would be very difficult to transmit the ideas that we are talking about, especially as the world in the last few thousand years has become more complex, more global, more shifting, more changing. Texts are that which anchor that transmission. And there is no greater mystical tradition that is compiled in texts than ours. So what I want to do each week is I'm going to go through a bit of the history of how Kabbalistic ideas come about, and what are those ideas, and what was the journey of the Jewish people. It's going to be really like we're kind of like in a chronological hovercraft. We're going to go very fast in some respects, because I want to look at this as a continuum and how we have made the transition to where we are now. It is not the case, and I don't want anybody running out of the room in terror, throwing their yarmulke in the bin on the way out, but it is not apparently the case that we have always known what we know now. Now you might sit there and going, oh, David's being facetious, but I'm not. There are people who believe that what we know now has always been known. They are what we might call homogenizers of revelation. They want to try and read back and say, well, so-and-so, you know, it's for sure the Rambam read the Zohar. For sure. He just decided not to talk about it. That sort of statement, if you are, even if you're not familiar with that, you're familiar with that type of statement. But in fact, it's much more exciting to realize that we haven't always known what we know now, because it means that revelation is an ongoing and constant interruption into Jewish history and shifts things, shifts our direction, shifts history, literally shifts history. Marx was, in my opinion, my humble opinion, at the end of the day, wrong. I mean, for me to say Marx is wrong is a big statement, because Marx is right about a great many things, but I don't believe that it is material conditions that drive human history. I believe it is ideas. I don't believe it's economic materialism, it is ideas. They are the true movers of history. All right, so much for a quasi-intro, but I want us to understand what I'm going to be doing so no one goes, well, why did he start talking about books? What is the first book that the field of Kabbalah, whether you are coming from a scholastic perspective in the academic field of Kabbalistic study carried on at universities, and there is that field, or whether you are coming from the perspective of a Kabbalist with his talus over his head in Mea Shearim, or whether you are running around in some orchard in California playing Ooga Booga, what would we generally regard as the oldest Kabbalistic text? Anyone know? Sorry? Good. So I asked that question in order to get an idea of where the audience is at. So the gentleman here and others said, what about this book? Perfect. Shkoyach. Sefer Yetzirah. What is Sefer Yetzirah? Put your hand up if you've heard of Sefer Yetzirah. Put your hand up if you've never heard of Sefer Yetzirah. Very good. Very good. Sefer Yetzirah, we might translate that. What's the meaning of the word Sefer? Book. So it's the book of what we might translate Yetzirah as formation. Sefer Yetzirah is not, strictly speaking, a Kabbalistic book. That statement is washing over here and people are going, okay, what's the next sentence? But the point is that that's quite a radical statement, and I'm going to unpack it a little bit. I believe it is the first Kabbalistic book, not because of what's in it, Oh, in other words, because of what's in it, not because of what it meant to be. And I'm going to explain that, because we're going to talk about the Sefer Yetzirah and its foundational role in the unfolding revelation of Kabbalah. Here's the deal. Sefer Yetzirah is a book that is mentioned in very early texts. It's mentioned in the Talmud. The famous story of Rava and Rav Zera, he's looking at Rava Bara Gavra is the famous statement of the Gemara, that a sage called Rava, an Amora of the 4th century, used Sefer Yetzirah, a book called Sefer Yetzirah. He used it to make a dude. He made a person, he made a man, using these techniques and energies of this particular book. So obviously, thousands and tens of thousands of Jewish people that are reading this Talmudic passage over centuries are wondering, what's that book? And where could we get our hands on that book? But the reality is that we don't know anything about Sefer Yetzirah. No one's talking about it, no one's really aware of it throughout the Talmudic period. And the first sign we have of it, by which time legends have developed that whatever it is, it was written by Abraham, and maybe edited by Rabbi Akiva. Obviously, two very big figures from Jewish history had a hand in it, which gives it a kind of credence and approbation, whatever it is. And then at some point, by the end of the Gaonic period, that is by the end of the 9th, 10th centuries, so only 1,000 years ago, or 1,100 years ago, the text is known. The text is known. It appears. And suddenly, all the great rabbis of the generations from, say, the 900s onwards are writing commentaries on it, telling people what it might mean. One of the famous early commentaries on it was, of course, if you're living towards the end of the Gaonic period and you've got a text that a Gaon is going to comment on, then one of those Gaonim is going to be Sadja. So Sadja Gaon has a commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, but so do a number of other late Gaonim and early Rishonim. From the 9th, 10th century, it exists in different kind of forms, variations, but in a recognizable form. It's not printed, of course, until much later. It's not printed until the 1600s, so it's kind of late on the scene of printing as far as Jewish history is concerned. But I can tell you that everybody who has ever stuck their nose in Kabbalistic literature has read that book. Everybody has read that book. And the reason it is regarded by Kabbalists as a mystical text, and we might talk about what exactly Kabbalah means in that context, but it's so often the case that people who lecture courses on Kabbalah dive into a definition of Kabbalah at the start and people's eyes glaze over, because there's no point trying to define what Kabbalah is without actually looking at what it's saying, and then you can work it out what it is. But the reason everybody looks at it is because it tells us, it describes how God created the universe. And it tells us that God created the world, I'm using the word olam, meaning world or universe, created this physical reality through a set of combinations. God was able to do combinations of something called the 10 Sefirot, the 10 Sefirot, and the 22 letters of, or actually the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. As I state. Now, in talks like this, people will often go, well, the 10 Sefirot. I'm sure he's going to explain that, and I'm sure he's going to unpack that. Some of you might even be sitting here going, I've heard a lot about the 10 Sefirot, but I'm not really sure entirely what they are. Let's see if David Solomon can actually tell me. But I'm not going to right now. I want you to realize that when you open up Sefer Yetzirah, and normally that would be done by someone in kind of private, because you wouldn't want people knowing that you were taking an interest in this material, because no doubt your parents or your teachers or your elders or your counselors in somewhere will come along and go, not for you. But the first thing you're going to encounter is this fact that God creates the world through 10 Sefirot and 22 Hebrew letters, and you have no idea what that means. It is not the case that Kabbalists open up a book like, you know, like in a Harry Potter movie and go, ah. Most Kabbalists, when they open up these Sfarim, these books for the first time, have no idea. And it's very clear from the early commentaries on Sefer Yetzirah that we don't really know what the 10 Sefirot are at that stage. In fact, Sa'adji Gaon even tells you, you're not supposed to think about what they mean. Just accept it. When the Sefer Yetzirah says, Blom picha miledaber, hold your mouth from talking, it means that whatever it is, you can't talk about it, and you don't know about it. Yet. The 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, we know. The Sefer Yetzirah also tells us that the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, that God invests in creating the world, invests divine intelligence in the world through 32 pathways of wisdom. 32 pathways of wisdom. Once again, we only have illusions as to what that might mean. Commentators will come along and they will say, I'm talking Kabbalistic commentators who are trying to come to terms with this textual revelation. They'll say, oh, well, the 32 is the 22 plus the 10. And you're going, okay, what does that mean? Others will come along and they say, the number 32 is significant. Why is the number 32 significant? Why is the number 32 significant? Why is the number 32 significant in relation to creation?
It's Lev, it's the heart.
Lev means the heart, but why is that connected to creation?
Because the heart is the seat of wisdom.
Everything you're saying is absolutely right, but it's not the right answer that I'm looking for. It is absolutely right that it connects to the word lev, which is lamed bet, which is 32. And in fact, they make a whole big deal about that. But what I was looking at was specifically in relation to the act of creation. 32 times the name Elohim is mentioned in the first chapter of Genesis. 32 times. That means that there are 32 different investments of divine energy into creation. Now, what the Sefer Yetzirah is telling you, if you extract its essential idea, is that what God did, you can do. This is a manual to access divine creative power. Divine creative power can be channeled into this world by you to create stuff. Divine energy is channeled into the world through by the practitioner through 231 gates. The famous Rala Sharim, 231 gates. And what you realize is that the 231 gates are the 22 letters placed in an array, a circular array, and you are going to have 221 point lines that are going to connect them all. Yep? Because that's the formula, isn't it? 22 squared is 464, over 2 gives you 231, or 462 gives you 231. Now, that takes us really in another direction, because once you start to understand the Sefer Yetzirah, also the Sefer Yetzirah is talking about the fact that there are different perspectives and understand, there's world and there's soul and there's year, all corresponding to this idea of the paradigm of space, time, spirituality. And what a lot of people have come to realize is that they can actually use the Sefer Yetzirah as a deep form of creative meditation. And there are people throughout Jewish history who have claimed to have created things like a golem. Yep, everybody's familiar with a golem. There's a few of them running around Melbourne, I'm sure you've seen them. Some of the ones I created, I couldn't control them all, I apologize. You usually see them in Glicks on a Friday morning. So, and I didn't mean you, Yossi. And if you are deep into Sefer Yetzirah and you're doing all that, then what you're actually doing is creating realities in your mind. You are emblazoning them, and you are following through the divine formula of creation in order to literally, with your mind, carve these things out of the ground around you, raise them up, and they become what they become. And there are many different interpretations of how Sefer Yetzirah works. But we're still not really at what we call Kabbalah, because no one really knows yet what these 10 Sefirot are. And there's a very, very good chance that they were something else entirely. Scholars will tell you that it has more in common with Pythagorean mysticism than it does with later Kabbalah. After the Zohar, which is already the 13th century, most of the commentators on Sefer Yetzirah are going to tell you that these 10 Sefirot are our 10 Sefirot, the ones that we talk about in Kabbalah. But it's a big love dafka. We're not sure. And certainly none of the great sages of the later Gaonic and early medieval period are telling you that, because they don't know about that. They just know that there's some kind of abstract force that is related to numbers, and that they are some kind of permutating abstract system of divine energies, creative energies, but that's all we really know. Those of you who are interested, you see, I thought we were going to be around a table, so I brought a copy of each of the books. This is a classic. This is one of the Vilna edition of the Sefer Yetzirah. It's facsimile of the of a printing, a 19th century printing. And what it is, basically, they treat it like a Mishnah. So you will have the central text, and then you'll have all the commentaries around it. And each Mishnah will tell you a condensed, very, very condensed and opaque piece of information. Although the Sefer Yetzirah is not overly fashionable today necessarily, it still forms a foundational text for any journey in Jewish mysticism in Kabbalah, because so many later texts refer to it. The whole concept that we have, for example, in contemporary spirituality particularly in Chassidut and so on, that talks about concepts like Ratzov Vashov, running and returning as a spiritual paradigm, whether that applies to angels or whether it applies to us or the creation as a whole. These ideas can be read back into Sefer Yetzirah, and some of those terminologies are read back into come from Sefer Yetzirah. And there's no more famous terminology that comes from Sefer Yetzirah than the concept of 10 Sefirot. But when Sefer Yetzirah first appears, it does not seem that they are understanding it the way we understand it, or as it came to be understood later in the revelations of Jewish history. Yeah? So where did that come from? Well, I'm watching the time and I have to be very careful. Is that really the time? Is that really the time? Ow! I have 3 books to discuss tonight and I have discussed one of them. If you want, don't play with the clock, Rabbi, don't play with the clock. If you have an yearning to look at Sefer Yetzirah, or you want to make a journey and you want to understand it and you want a good translation and a commentary, then I can't recommend anything greater in our generation than the late Rav Aryeh Kaplan's translation and commentary. Bearing in mind that Kaplan wrote that commentary and translation bringing the full weight of 20th century knowledge about the development of Kabbalah. So he has no problems reading the Ari into it, reading the Ramak into it, reading the Zohar into it, or the anyone later he will use to explicate that. But that's also brilliant, because Kaplan was one of those people that also realized that Kabbalah was being unfolded in time. It is being revealed, and the revealing and the synthesizing is ongoing. What we need to understand is that Sefer Yetzirah establishes certain terminologies and concepts that Sefer Yetzirah might know what it means, but we don't really know what it means. What we do know is that the book is trying to tell us that we can channel divine creativity to make things for ourselves and for the world, and that it's using elemental combinations. It's not such a far cry from contemporary technology and science, it's just that they had different concepts of what those elementals might be. But everything in the world is created ultimately from the combination of elementals. And here we're talking about combinations of 22 Hebrew letters. All the Hebrew letters are creative, dynamic forces. If you can manipulate them, you can create things. And a lot of people got involved in Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah also tells you, and this is one of the reasons why it was attributed to Abraham, at the end of it, it tells you that Abraham used Sefer Yetzirah to make souls. You know, when the Torah says, and the souls which Abraham made in Haran. Yeah? So that's understood by the mystics literally. He literally made souls using the power of the Sefer Yetzirah. We don't know what that means. People can look at me in confusion and curiosity. I can't help them. And not many people can help them. How you make a soul with the Sefer Yetzirah. Go home, read the Sefer Yetzirah, try it. If it works, tell me. We read the Sefer Yetzirah because it's there, because everybody says, oh, the Sefer Yetzirah, it's dangerous, don't get involved. But interestingly enough, it doesn't come across as a book of sorcery. It comes as a book of tremendously high spiritual power. And a very, very monotheistic, refined philosophical view of the concept of God, but it's out of reach. It's out of reach. Now, the story for our purposes, and I'm probably already going to have to apologize for going 5 minutes over tonight, but I want to make sure that I transmit this journey that I want to talk about. Our story really starts, the origin of what we call Kabbalah actually happens a couple of hundred years after people are already aware of the Sefer, or have already written some of the major commentaries on Sefer Yetzirah. By the time you get to the 1100s, yeah? Where would we be looking at in terms of just to see if anyone knows this, what would we call the center of the Kabbalistic world? When I say the Kabbalistic world, where are the mystics congregating and producing figures that are revealing or receiving revelations and looking at different types of material that they are expounding mystically, developing innovative ideas. Anyone know where that was happening in the 1100s? No. Way before Tzfat, way before. You go to Tzfat in the 1100s, you're going to find a bunch of Karaites and probably some Islamic rulers that aren't really that chilled about Jews moving around the place. There might be a few Sufis you might learn off, but no, it's not the 11. It's not Tzfat. So it's not quite Spain either. It all starts in the southeast of France, in Provence. Provence is really where the greatest Jewish mystics of the time were living. And it is in Provence that we first see the emergence of the next big Sefer that is going to, there's not the only Sefer, but the next big one, if we can only talk about a few, that's really going to influence Jewish mystics, because everyone's going to look at it and try and work out what's going on, just like the Sefer Yetzirah had been for the last few hundred years. We're now adding something. It's a new revelation. Well, it's a revelation of something that looks like it's been around for a while, but we don't know of it before the 1100s really. And it is and it's a book called Sefer Very good. Very good. Sefer Bahir. Now, the Kabbalists of the early Middle Ages are busy. They are reconciling different streams that are coming to them. One, of course, is Sefer Yetzirah. The other are some very interesting configurations of 10. Sefer Yetzirah tells us of the 10 Sefirot, divine creative potentialities. We don't know what they are. The Mishnah tells us, Ba'asara ma'amarot nivra ha'olam. In 10 utterances was the world created. It's a famous midrash. In fact, it's in the Mishnah. It's in Pirkei Avot, chapter 5. But we also know that by the time you get to the Middle Ages, people had philosophized Ptolemy's cosmology so that the universe itself was understood as 10 concentric spheres. The whole basis of that was the whole basis of astronomy in the Middle Ages, the Ptolemaic model. And once you get to people like the Rambam, Maimonides, that's how they see the universe. Earth is at the center, and you've got these 10 concentric circles which mediate between whatever is on the other side. And for the Rambam, it was all divine intelligences, and then outside that you've got the angelic realm and you've got God and so on. But the number 10 keeps configuring. And then you get people saying, oh, well, you know what? We know from a midrash, some of the more mystical midrashim are giving us an insight into not just God from the perspective of creation, but God from the perspective of God itself. What's actually happening in the divine personality that is reacting to creation? In other words, what's going on with God before God creates the world? What's going on with God now that God has created the world? What does God do while God sustains the existence of the world? It's looking at the hidden interiority of the divine. Midrash gives us a far greater window into that. And what starts to emerge is a book like Sefer Bahir, which is not really a book. It's more a collection of texts that may not even be Kabbalah yet. No one really knows, but it is definitely talking about the attributes of God. And these attributes are being formed into a kind of a pattern of divine creative attributes. And that pattern is starting, the elements, the symbolic elements of that pattern of 10 is starting to be given names. Each of the 10 is starting to take on a name and an identity. It's not yet quite what's going to happen. But for example, we know that there's the famous verse in Divrei Hayamim, Lecha Hashem Agdula v'Agvura v'Tiferet v'Netzach v'Ahod kichol b'Shamayim u'Ba'aretz. So that's already giving us the names of quite a number of the Sefirot. And then you're going to have repeated patterns throughout Tanakh that they are midrashically and mystically reading that Chokhmah, Binah, Da'at. So they're starting to put names to the attributes of God, and the Sefer Bahir is linking that. The Sefer Bahir, which has very clearly read Sefer Yetzirah, it's fully aware of it. It talks about the 32 pathways of wisdom. It talks about a number of concepts that come up in Sefer Yetzirah, and of course it's aware of the 10 Sefirot. But its pattern of 10 Sefirot and the names that it applies are not necessarily what we now know them as. What is emerging is an understanding that revelation happens in a pattern. And the Bahir, which is a mystical midrash, it doesn't read like Sefer Yetzirah as a physics book. It is a midrash, which means it's much more narrative, much more parabolic. It gives you many more naturalistic metaphors. It's talking about kings and gardens. It's talking about divine flow, not divine investment, but the way that divine energy flows into creation like water into a garden. If we didn't know any better, and we don't, we might even assume that a very strong feminine or female presence in the composition of Bahir, because it is very non-linear and much more concerned with naturalistic metaphors. Many less sharp lines than the Sefer Yetzirah. Much more circular, much more flowing, much more intuitive. It's difficult to understand Bahir. But the key takeaway is it's also talking about the concept of cosmic time, that time itself is cyclic. It talks about the fact that the soul, it's clearly alluding to reincarnation. Whoa, here's an idea that wasn't there before. The idea that certain souls, if not all souls, incarnate in different time cycles, because cosmic time is cyclic. What has happened before does happen again. Not in some kind of Nietzschean eternal recurrence, but as a type of almost fractal relationship between the creation of the world at the very beginning and how the unfolding of time reflects those patterns. And the Sefirot are the attributes of God which are patterned. So as to be able to understand revelation in the world and what the divine is. It's not an easy book to understand the Bahir, but the takeaway is that what were formerly just numbers are now the attributes of God. But we're still not at what we would call definitively Kabbalah as it's going to come to be known. The first big influential text that's really going to give us that, by the way, if you want to look at the Bahir, so the Bahir, it's very difficult to find a Bahir published by itself, except maybe in some extremely modern academic editions. One of the ones is Margoliot's Bahir, which is actually at the back of the volume of Tikkunei Zohar. So he actually printed the Bahir. It's got, And if you want to read it in translation, Kaplan's translation of Bahir is floating somewhere just above appalling. As much as I've extolled his translation on commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, which was a work that he really spent years he went into, my theory is that Kaplan's translation of the Bahir was published posthumously, because Kaplan passed away in 1983, from a draft. I cannot believe that Kaplan would have meant for the translation to go out in the way that it did. It is a translation, but it's it's got some problems. Yeah?
Do we know who wrote the Bahir, or was it?
So we don't know who wrote the Bahir. We don't know who wrote the Bahir. But you know what? I'm thrilled to the max that you asked that question, because if you hadn't, I would have remembered later that I didn't say what I'm about to. So thank you.
How do you know it came from Provence then? Like, it's got to come.
Okay, so let me first answer who something about the authorship of Bahir, and then I'm going to answer that question of how do we know it came from Provence. The traditional authorship of Sefer Bahir is no less an august figure than the 1st century Tana, Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana is mentioned in various places in Midrash in other contexts. He is an enormously interesting figure, was a colleague of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, a teacher of many of the mystics of the generation. He was regarded as the greatest mystic sage of that period of the Tanaim. Huge figure. But that's a legendary attribution. We don't have any evidence of that. And not that I'm sitting here going, everything I'm going to tell you is evidenced, but it needs to be pointed out. We don't have evidence of that. Neither do we have evidence to support the statement, and this is the second part, and this is really important to understand. It's not that we have evidence that it came from Provence. It's that prior to the circles in Provence, we don't know about it. When I say we don't know about it, no one is talking about it. And if no one is talking about it, from our perspective 1,000 years later, we can't say it didn't exist, but we don't know about it. So we talk about its origins being from Provence, because that is where it was revealed. That is where it was revealed. There's a lot more I could say about Bahir. I'm watching the time, it's already 9 o'clock and I've gone over, and there's a lot of things I wanted to say about Bahir. But that's why I'm focusing on this takeaway. The numbers have become attributes, and they are now embedded not in a scientific text like Sefer Yetzirah or an abstract text, but in a midrashic text that gives midrashic style metaphors and talks about the inner processes of God. And I know that I'm already got minus a minute, but we're going to talk about the next book, because then I want to wrap it up, because next week I'm going to start an entirely new phase. But the next major text that we would want to know about after Sefer Bahir, and I'm moving forward 100 years now, and so that no one's confused, I'm going to bye-bye Bahir. You can still read the Bahir, but we're going off the board. Bahir is stunning, by the way. The Bahir is stunning. I mean, I'm not even giving across the literary qualities of these books. They are saturated with mystical vibe and perception. And if you understand even just a little bit of Hebrew, you could make your way through the Sefer Bahir, even with Kaplan's translation. However, there's a new translation. Jesse Barksdale's writing in the States, writing a new translation on Bahir. I've seen tiny little bits of it. It looks very nice. Hopefully it'll come out very soon. But the book, moving forward 100 years to the middle of the 1200s, where's the center of now? Now where's the center? Where's the center now? It's no longer Provence. It left Provence and it went to Gerona and the whole area of Barcelona. Why? Because one of the greatest sages of the 1200s is living in Gerona. someone who definitely was studying the Sefer Yetzirah and the Bahir, and is a big, big building block in the synthesis of those two ideas. And of course that's the Ramban, Nachmanides. But after Gerona, why are you smiling? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, oh, cool. It's just I said the Ramban. It's not often when I say the Ramban and people start smiling. I'm going, is there a joke about the Ramban? I don't know. No, that's good. No, perfect. And then from Gerona, it moves to, anyone know? And this is the really big shift. I mean, I know when I say this, you're going to go, oh, he's just telling me another place name in Europe. Like, really, why is that important? It's true. At this level, it's not exactly important, but these are quite monumentous shifts if you understand the inner workings of the history of Spanish and French Jewry at the time. But it moves to Castile, in the center of what is today Spain. Moves like around Toledo and these places. Very, very significant, important Jewish communities, but also mystically saturated Jewish communities. And the next book that we would look at, and I'm going to speak about only for 2 minutes because we have to finish up, is a book called Sha'arei Orah. Now in Sha'arei Orah, which was written by, who knows who wrote Sha'arei Orah? Sorry? Oh, you see, that's a really, it's not a correct answer, but it's a really interesting answer. It wasn't Abu Lafya, but I'm going to come back to that in a second. It was written by Rabbi Yosef, and this is the first time I'm putting an author up, because this is the first book in our list that actually has an author who we know wrote it. And it's a very fascinating author, and I would have liked a bit more time to go into his personal history, because he's one of the seriously interesting people in our continuum. It's Rabbi Yosef Gicatilla. And of course, Gicatilla of Castile. In Sha'arei Orah, Sha'arei Orah is really the first book, already 100 years after the revelations of the Bahir, which may have been around for a lot longer, but the first kind of book that really starts to look like a Kabbalistic book that we would recognize. It is talking, but it is not talking about the Sefirot in the first instance. It's a book about the names of God. God is revealed through God's names. And God has 10 primary names which correspond to divine attributes, divine creative energies, and yes, ladies and gentlemen, the 10 Sefirot. And the 10 Sefirot are, says Gicatilla, and the 10 Sefirot are, says Gicatilla. I'm smiling because I know the effect of what I'm about to say. Malchut, Hod, Netzach, Tiferet, Gvura, Chesed, Da'at, Binah, Chochmah, and Keter, which of course is 11. But the real issue is that it's gone from bottom to top. That is because the big innovation of the Sha'arei Orah is to link the names of God, the modes of revelation with the names of God as the essence of God, revealing through the names of these modes, taking the idea from Sefer Yetzirah that you can actually channel divine energy, but it doesn't start with you going hocus pocus ooga booga. And remember, Gicatilla had started off as a student of Abu Lafya. And this gentleman mentioned Abu Lafya, and unfortunately we don't have time to go into Abu Lafya. I've spoken about him elsewhere. But Abu Lafya's big idea was names. He wasn't into Sephirotic Kabbalah. No one really was necessarily into Sephirotic Kabbalah. He was into names. And then Gicatilla makes the switch over to a more, what we call Sefirotic Kabbalah, away from the yogic exercises and breathing and meditational exercises of Abulafia, whose primary aim, Avraham Abulafia, Jikatila's first teacher, primary aim was what? What was he wanting to achieve from all these mystical meditations and study? What does he want? We know what Jikatila wants. Well, we know what Abulafia wants. Sorry, Mashiach, not Mashiach. I mean, yeah, that's quite funny, because Abulafia probably did want that, but if you asked Abulafia who's likely to be Mashiach, he'd look around and go, well, you know, I don't want to sound immodest, but what Abulafia is looking for is prophecy. Because Abulafia spends decades being obsessed with Maimonides' philosophical word, the guide to the perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim. A completely rationalist, medieval philosophical work that Abulafia said, no, forget philosophy, forget rationalism, it's full of mystical secrets. And he interprets them. And when the Rambam tells you can achieve prophecy through activating your active intellect and having a unio mystica with the divine intelligence, Abulafia says, bring it on, I want some of that. So he starts to develop all sorts of techniques to do it. Jikatila is his student. But Jikatila then makes a transition to Sefirotic Kabbalah, where he sees human attributes as reflections of the divine. It's not the case, as philosophy is telling us, that we have to anthropomorphize the words in the Torah to think that when we talk about the arm of God, that we're talking about the might of God. That's very nice. But what's really happening is we have an arm because we are microcosmic reflections of that divine energetic interaction with the world. Sorry? Yes, that's the transition. In other words, he starts from Malchut. It's 10 chapters, each one dedicated to a name and a sphira and an attribute and all its parallel signifiers right throughout, in order for us to meditate and particularly use this program of ascent in states of consciousness and reification of our own bodies to ascend, and particularly in prayer. We are no longer using these techniques to change the world. We're using these techniques to change divine configurations to help our reality. We are, in a sense, attempting to influence God through our prayer and through our channeling, which is coming from ourselves. It's a very, very big shift. But for our purposes, the main thing to realize is that Sha'arei Orah, written probably around 1273, probably, somewhere around there, not printed of course till the 1500s, but written around there and distributed in manuscript, is a book, I'll get you 1 second, that lays out very clearly, here are the Sefirot, here's the structure, here's the order of them. So basically from Sha'arei Orah, it's kind of fixed. Sha'arei Orah is not a massive text. This is my copy of Sha'arei Orah, and that's about that long, but it's divided into 10 gates, each gate dealing with a different sphira. Incredibly cornerstone, literally turning the cornerstone book in the unfolding of the revelation that is going to come. Yes?
I've got a question, it might be a stupid question, but you gave about the hand of God and the hand of God. What was new about the Sha'arei Orah?
Okay. It's a good question. But I think inside the question there's perhaps a misunderstanding, or perhaps I didn't make it clear. When the Torah talks about the hand of God, difficult to understand necessarily how the rabbis of the Talmud that I mentioned in the Haggadah who were quoting it might have understood it. Some of them might have actually understood it literally. If you said to one of the sages of the Talmud, God's got a body, it's just a very big, ethereal, highly refined spiritual body, but it's a body, they might have gone, okay, I don't see a conflict there with monotheism. The idea that, of course, God is completely incorporeal and that to corporealize God is a serious no-no is really a product of the Middle Ages. So medieval philosophy arrives at that, and then of course Jewish philosophers are caught with the accusations of the Kalam and so on, saying, oh, look at your Torah full of anthropomorphisms, the hand of God, the eye of God, and then philosophers like Sa'adja and the Rambam, they're coming along and they're saying, oh, no. It's not like God has eyes or God has legs or God has arms. Those are metaphors basically for the might of God, and they're just put in terms of which we can understand. Gikatilla is saying no. They're not simply there so that we can understand them. We are how we are because we are a direct reflection of the pattern of divine creative interaction. So yeah, in a way, God has an arm, but it's not a body. It's a particular type of creative energy that works in symmetry in relation to the other dynamic framework energies which the Bahir spoke about. When the Bahir spoke about a pattern, a framework of energies, these are dynamically interrelated. The Bahir, and I'm glad you asked that because I know that I'm well over, but I'm just going on a rant for a minute because I have to. The Bahir is the first text that gives us the whole idea that there is within the divine, or that the divine can be understood in masculine and feminine form. That in fact masculine and feminine forms must be in harmony to create the flow of creative output from the framework of energies. And along comes Gikatilla and says, very nice, but here are the actual Sefirot, and what's actually happening is it's about us and our ability to channel that divine creativity by ascending ourselves through that framework, not bringing it down as hocus pocus, but actually ascending it ourselves in prayer and becoming a full channel for the revelation of light and of the name of God. And of course, it is Sha'arei Orah that really explicates the idea, of course, that the human form is paralleled after the name of God. The tetragrammaton, Yud Hey Vav Hey, which is the name associated with the Sefirah of Tiferet, is, when placed vertically, a human form. And therefore, each of those letters, in the form that it is, has a full representation of the Sefirot. And on this point I will finish, because that itself is a big revelation, but on this point I will finish by saying that Gikatilla writes in his famous Gate 5, which is the Gate on Tiferet, which is one of the most astonishing reads in all of Kabbalistic literature for anyone who wants to look at it. He explains to you that other religions, and he's talking about Abrahamic religions, he's talking about Christianity and Islam, are caught in the Chesed and Gvura paradigm. Chesed and Gvura are two of the Sefirot on the right, and one on the right, one on the left, that deal with kindness and benevolence on the one hand, and withholding and limitation on the other. They are caught in that good, bad, Chesed, Gvura, judgment, mercy paradigm. You have to be on the middle pillar, which is the Jewish people who are sitting in the place of Tiferet between those two domains, who can, only the middle pillar can transcend vertically. It's not simply a horizontal alignment, it is a vertical alignment, and therefore that is why the Jewish people are capable of synthesis. And therefore only by synthesizing can you then rise. But if you are on the middle column, you can rise, because then you go up to Da'at, divine consciousness, and ultimately up to Keter. So I know that's a very advanced point to end with, and I didn't look at the pattern of the Sefirot, which I would have liked to, and I had to come to an end. We will look more at that pattern of what, I mean, you know, the famous pattern that we now talk about. This is already, by the time you get to Sha'arei Orah, you've already got Keter, Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at, and of course, if there's Keter, there's not Da'at, and that's confirmed already in the Sefer Yetzirah. We don't even know what the Sefer Yetzirah is talking about. The Sefer Yetzirah had already said there's always 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11. So we know that there's that relationship, and then Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchut. And therefore, Am Yisrael, being Tiferet, is able to raise up on that vertical level, and because they're able to synthesize from the other domains. I hope all of that has not been too confusing. I'm sorry I went over time, and I hope that we got something out of that. Just to remind us, I talked about Sefer Yetzirah, I talked about Sefer Bahir, and I talked about Sha'arei Orah, just the beginning of the journey that I want to do with you over the next 4 weeks in this Kabbalistic journey through time.